Hi, once again. We're going to resume the narrative, completing our discussion of Egyptian civilization, and then move on to consider the first Iron Age civilization, namely um, the um, the Hebrews. And so that is the overall agenda. Are there any questions about last lecture or other matters that you want to raise at this point? Very good. So before I get into the lecture, I want to do catch up on the review questions. So we're going to do two review questions today. Um, in the first place, I'm going to consider the question 3 that deals with um, the history of writing, the invention and history of writing. And then I'm going to do question 5. Why did economic classes develop in early civilizations? So taking the, I'm sorry, I'm going to postpone question 3 until later on in the lecture because it fits in more easily. So I'll deal with question 5, the development of economic classes. So in answering this question, basically you want to begin by noting that in the Stone Age, during the period of hunting and gathering, there were no economic classes. There was essential equality between the people, and even a high degree of gender equality, and sharing and so on during the hunting and gathering phase. And then at the beginning of the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, once again, of course, now you have sedentary populations, villages springing up all over the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, but people now were farmers for the most part. But once again, there was a high degree of equality between these villages. There were no landlords at the beginning. What began to change the situation, now we come to the origin of the classes, was that gradually the Fertile Crescent dried out, land became good agricultural land, was more and more limited and reserved for the river valleys, the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. And under these conditions, of course, there were all kinds of disputes that began to develop between the villages, and there was questions of property. And as the Neolithic age continued between 10,000 and roughly 3,000, what we call village big men arose. They're referred to as big men. That is to say, people who had a lot of prestige within the communities. They were good at fighting, or they were considered to be wise, or what have you. And these people, they emerged as a kind of upper strata, not yet a class. But over time, especially when agriculture is constituted in the and limited to the river valleys, these people eventually end up as landlords, as a class, who are collecting rents from the rest of the peasant agriculturalists. And so you have a social polarization once we reach the Bronze Age. Another factor is that um, in this period, certainly outside, first of all, there's a lot of conflict within these societies over land, but also there are invasions and repeated invasions. And sometimes the invaders take over. And as a result, these invaders become part of the upper class. So it's a combination of the emergence of big men and invasion, war and invasion, which leads to the constitution of what we call economic classes. That's this upper class, this landlord class, out of which the state arises itself, stands in opposition to the mass of the peasants. The mass of the peasants have to pay rents and taxes. They don't like it. There's a built-in contradiction here. And this is what we refer to as class and class conflict or antagonism. That's the basically the answer. Well, I'll come back to the other question of writing in a little while. So we were discussing in Egyptian civilization last time, and I remember I gave a lot of stress to the religious life, the fact that the greatest of the monuments of Egypt were the pyramids and so on, and these were essentially tombs, and tombs to prepare for the afterlife, which was central. The underworld, the afterlife presided over by Osiris, the god Osiris, was very important. However, also toward the end of the lecture, I noted that Egypt had thousands of, something like 2,000 gods. These gods had basically been local deities. The state comes into being in 3100 BC, but all down the Nile Valley, there were these smaller temples dedicated to these local gods. And all told, there are about 2,000 of them. But the most important gods were the gods associated with the monarchy, with the pharaoh, who I explained was so powerful in Egyptian society. And I made the point that these two gods, Horus and Amun-Re, the sun god and the falcon god, were considered to be immediately connected with the monarchy, with the royal house. There was later on in the course of the 2nd century BC, by the second millennium BC, after 2000, Osiris and Isis were seen, these two gods. Osiris is the god of the underworld, and Isis, they were seen to be, they had offspring, and the pharaoh was considered to be, who was himself a god, was considered to be the offspring of these two gods, Osiris and Isis. Now, I want to single out Isis, who's a female god, because Isis, who is often represented as a motherly figure holding a child, is really a throwback to the so-called mother goddesses of the Stone Age. There is a continuation. I mentioned this when I was discussing the Stone Age. These mother goddesses, which have to do with female sexuality and reproduction, are found in many places during the Old Stone Age. Well, Isis is a continuation of it, and she is commonly seen with a child in her arms. And historians have noted this, and of course, um, this cult of Isis continues right down through the period of the Greeks, down into the Roman period, and is um, uh, the goddess Isis, in a sense, was co-opted by early Roman Catholicism and became the Virgin Mary in the Roman Catholic faith. So this idea of the goddess, um, this female goddess, who, to be sure, is subordinated to the male gods, is already present in pre-Christian religiosity. Now, the religion that I've been speaking about, the 2,000 cults that existed, there were many, many temples. This Egyptian religion was a temple religion. There were a proliferation of thousands of temples all over Egypt, and the priests were kind of caste, an elite in Egyptian society, and they maintained these temples. Of course, the pharaoh controlled these priests. They were subordinated and were an important part of state authority. They certainly the priests were religious figures, but they also had clearly a political role in ensuring the obedience of the rest of the population and propitiating the forces, the supernatural forces that controlled society. So, yes, religious, but also very political. Now, as I say, they were an important adjunct to the power of the pharaoh. But it is notable that as a very significant event in Egyptian history is that during the 14th century before Christ, there was a pharaoh by the name of Akhenaten. Sorry, I got it. Akhenaten, the pharaoh Akhenaten, actually Akhenaten the fourth, but never mind, who created the official sun god was Amon-Ra, and this was the biggest temple in Egypt. Akhenaten creates a rival sun god and tries to do away with Amon-Ra, and a big fight there breaks out. And as a matter of fact, Akhenaten not only tries to do away with Amon-Ra and the priests who control that cult, but also he begins to question the legitimacy of most of the temple cults, most of the gods that are being worshipped by Egypt. And he begins, we have the written record of this, some of it recorded on stone, other elements on papyrus. He begins to assert the idea that Aton is in a way the single God, the only God. The attempt by Amenhotep to create a cult of Aton had to do with the struggle between Aton and the priests in Egypt. Amenhotep was trying to consolidate royal power and attacking the other gods and instituting this central cult, which is sort of completely controlled by the pharaoh, was the part of his attempt to centralize authority in the monarchy. Well, this attempt was defeated, and Egypt reverted to its. The priests basically recovered their power, things went on as before. But some writers who wrote about these struggles and so on claim that there is a relationship between this Aton sun god and the later monotheism of the Hebrews. That is to say, this was a kind of anticipation of Hebrew and Jewish monotheism already in ancient Egyptian civilization. Well, I mention it because this was a dispute. It's never been settled. Some really famous person who was very interested in all this was Sigmund Freud, who wrote an important book called Moses and Monotheism. And so it's one of the most interesting episodes, I would say, in Egyptian history. Now, I said, I remarked in the last lecture, notable is the lack of dynamism, the static quality of Egypt. No cities, just a few foreign invasions. We'll mention them shortly. The power of the pharaoh was absolute, and so there's a kind of static quality to Egyptian society, more so than in Mesopotamia, where you have many cities, you have invasions. There is a kind of developmental dynamic to Mesopotamia that doesn't seem to exist in Egypt. Nevertheless, there is an evolution in Egyptian society, and I want to more or less mention very briefly what we call the 4 stages in Egyptian history. There was, first of all, the proto-dynastic phase. We're talking about the formation of the Egyptian state, the emergence of the pharaohs, and so on, 3200 BC to 2665. Notice these dates, because I mentioned they were recording these things on stone, the priests, and so we have exact dating here. The proto-dynastic period. The second period is the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian Old Kingdom. What is notable about this is, first of all, that I explained that Menes, way back in 3100 BC, had united Lower and Upper Egypt to constitute the Egyptian state. Well, the truth of the matter is that Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, there was a tension between them. One of the problems of the state was to make sure that Upper and Lower Egypt stayed united. And so one of the ways this was done was that during the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh was actually buried twice. There were 2 when he went to the underworld. He was buried in Upper Egypt, and then he would be reburied. There would be 2 funeral ceremonies, which would accommodate Lower and Upper Egypt. It would placate the elites in Upper and Lower Egypt. That's what. Furthermore, the local government was in the hands of governors, and these governors enjoyed a considerable amount of autonomy. Finally, a last important characteristic is most of the pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom. And this period, there was little or no connection between Egypt and the outside world. Egypt was essentially isolated. And then we have the second notable period is the first intermediate period, which lasts a century. And this is a period of internal upheaval, and apparently foreign invaders came into Egypt as well. There was a certain amount of intrusion of foreigners. And so the priests who are controlling the written record speak about internal anarchy, that there is no government in Egypt. And furthermore, the lower classes, whose condition I've explained, are attacking the elites, the landlords, and the government officials. I'm quoting one of the stone inscriptions. The highborn are full of lamentation, but the poor are jubilant. And the quote continues, squalor is throughout the land. The priest is recording this. Squalor, there's disorder and squalor. The old organization is broken down. And finally, he notes, strangers have come into Egypt. Strangers have come into Egypt. So foreign invasion and social upheaval during the first intermediate period. The next period is the Middle Kingdom. And you can see this is the second millennium BC. Egypt is reunified under the pharaohs. And there is, as a result of the disorder of the intermediate period, there is a great stress on order and cohesion under the leadership of the pharaoh. Furthermore, the boundaries of Egypt are extended. Egypt conquers the Sudan. The state to the south of Egypt is Sudan, and that was conquered. And also the mouth of the Nile River was occupied by the state. And notably, there was an end to the absolute isolation of the Old Kingdom. Egypt began to have communication and especially commercial relations with neighboring countries. This, of course, means that merchants are becoming a little bit more important. But we know that the Egyptians, through trade largely, were in contact with Palestine, with the Greek islands in the Mediterranean, including the large island of Crete, and also to the south, Ethiopia. It's during this period that Ethiopian civilization begins. We next come to a period known as the Second Intermediate Period, 1785 to 1554. This is a period, the Middle Kingdom comes to an end because invaders coming down apparently from Palestine, their origins much further north, but they invaded from Palestine. They're known as the Hyksos. These Hyksos were able to conquer the Egyptians. The Egyptians had very little experience in fighting, as I've explained. And these Hyksos had superior military technology. They used war chariots drawn by horses. And they had bows and arrows, which were far superior to anything they shot them from these war chariots, breaking up the Egyptian infantry. And they had these much more powerful bows called composite bows made out of bone and bone and leather, and they were much better than wooden bows. And so this gave them a certain superiority. Well, the Hyksos occupied, I would say, mainly northern Egypt, lower Egypt, for a considerable period, obviously. But finally, in 1554, they were expelled, and a new phase, a unified Egypt called the New Kingdom, between 1554 and 1075. And um, once again, you see the stress on authority. I've mentioned the episode of Amenhotep. I've mentioned Amenhotep. This drive on the part of the state to increase its authority by attacking the temples. This is, of course, a theme of the New Kingdom, magnifying still further the authority um, of the pharaohs. Um, the Not only were the Hyksos expelled, but the Egyptians attempted to conquer um, Palestine and Syria. The Hyksos had come from there, and the Egyptians now sent their army, and there was a considerable, a certain period when Syria and Palestine were under Egyptian control. And the trading relationships that Egypt had also were intensified. And it's in this period also important is the fact that Egyptian art, I'm talking now about particularly the statues in Egypt, are very important. First of all, they're beautiful in themselves. Monumental statues of pharaohs and of great personalities, men and women. They're not anything like realistic statuary. They're gigantic statues, but nevertheless, there is a certain power to these statues and a skill in carving, which makes them genuine works of art. And the development of this art climaxes during this period. It's important because the Greeks learned how to sculpture in the first place from the Egyptians. So there is a real connection. Egyptian temples and statues, it is out of them that Greek temples and statues were born. Well, this is essentially the outline of the classic phase in Egyptian history. We note that around 1200 BC, the New Kingdom itself begins to collapse, and there are invasions by people coming from the north, people known as the Hittites, also the precursors of the classical Greeks, the Dorian Greeks, raid into Egypt, as do the Philistines. These are northern people who partially they act at sea, they have ships, and they invade Egypt. And at this point, too, it seems, according to the stories in the first 5 books of the New Testament, of the Hebrew New Testament, this seems to be the period with the collapse of the New Kingdom that the so-called Hebrews, more about them soon, some of them, it's important to note, only some of them had been made slaves by the Egyptians, and they exited from Egypt, the so-called exodus from Egypt, which is really the point of foundation of the Hebrew group and their religious life. It starts around this period right here. We'll come back to that. Now, this the, this decline of the New Kingdom is related to um, um, important changes that occur, say, from 1300 to 1000, the end of the second millennium BC. Millennium means 1,000 years. We're talking about the second millennium, 2000 to 1000. And now we're looking at particularly this period, 1300 to 1000, because these invasions are part of what historians refer to as the Indo-European migrations. New people coming from Central Asia and coming into the Middle East. And I mentioned them, the Hittites, who play an important political role, the Dorian Greeks, who are the precursors of the classical Greeks, the Philistines, who settle along the coast of northern Israel and Lebanon, and even the Iranians who are still with us, and also in India, the Aryans, another group, the so-called Indo-Europeans. Now, these Indo-Europeans, they had, I mentioned the Hyksos and their chariots. Well, the Indo-Europeans, their chariots were war chariots driven by horses, were the basic arm of fighting, and they used these chariots in terms of attacking the old civilizations in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. Now, one of the features of these chariots that we begin to notice is that, and indeed of the weapons that are being used by these people, is that they are iron. Instead of being made out of bronze, they're being made out of iron, which constitutes a veritable revolution. Because copper and bronze, first of all, are relatively rare. Only a few people can get a hold of this metal. It has to be bought from long distance, where iron ore is relatively much more common. It's locally available for smelting into weapons, or for that matter, into tools. And furthermore, it's superior to bronze. It's better than bronze. An iron plow can dig deeply into the earth, and iron weapons are powerful. And so these Indo-Europeans use these weapons. Well, of course, the old Egyptians of the Bronze Age or the older Mesopotamian civilizations were no match for people equipped with these weapons. So that's one point. But perhaps an even more important is the fact that with the many more people could afford to not only to own tools which were made out of iron, but also they would have weapons. They would have swords and knives and spears made out of iron, powerful stuff. And many more people, peasants, could make these weapons. Therefore, what I'm saying is that this invention of iron, the smelting of iron ore, this new technology, meant that the old control by the hierarchies of Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization, which had been one feature of it, basic feature, was bronze. Iron implies the democratization of warfare in the first place. Peasants, ordinary people, can wield these weapons. There is a democratization of warfare. And that, in a way, suggests a democratization of society. Remember, I said that these Bronze Age civilizations were very unequal and so on. Well, the distribution of these weapons over the long term, I'm not talking about full democracy. I'm not talking about Neolithic democracy. And I'm not talking about our version of democracy. But I'm saying that compared to the hierarchies of the Bronze Age, there is a much greater degree of um, participation. More people can act in this society. And war is, to be able to act in war is fundamental to the ancient world. Um, and beyond that, it means also that if people have more social and political power, also they can demand and participate in religious life. There's also implied a democratization of religious life, as you'll see. And of course, the Hebrews are an important, very important example of this democratization of religion, as we'll note. But furthermore, still discussing Iron Age technology, if you have plows, mainly made out of wood, but with the plowshare, which churns the soil, is made out of iron, you can dig much more deeply into the soil. You can turn it over. In fact, iron plows are able to allow plants to be set much more deeply into the soil, and they can reach areas of the soil where there is the land being relatively dry, where it's possible to get moisture, so that the Iron Age surpluses of agricultural goods increase, surpluses of food increase during from the we can date the Iron Age from 1200 BC onwards, and so there's greater abundance for more people than in the Bronze Age, and I would say overall greater participation on the part of the mass of the population, although let's not exaggerate. So these are revolutionary developments. They certainly are the preconditions for the emergence not only of the Hebrews, but also the Greeks, as you'll see. But another and final point I want to make about this period, not directly connected with iron, but also comes in at this moment from about 1100 BC in this area you see, this is the Eastern Mediterranean. If you have here's the Mediterranean Sea, okay? In this area right here, which is settled by people who stem from the Philistines, this area in the ancient times was known as Phoenicia. It's now Lebanon and maybe a part of northern Israel. In this area here, you get, this is sitting right on the coast. From after 1200, this becomes a big center of commercial life. Merchants play a huge role here in this area. This is one of the first centers of real commercial intensity in the Middle East. Come to think of it, Lebanon still has that role. It was here that the first alphabetical languages were written down. And this itself intensifies democracy, because I mentioned hieroglyphics and I mentioned cuneiform, and I said that they had thousands and thousands and thousands of characters. With alphabets, at first there were about around 10 of them. An ordinary person can learn an alphabet. What do we have? 26 letters. It's one of the first things one learns as a child. And so literacy now becomes way more possible. The invention of the alphabet is what I'm talking about. Now, So that's a very important development. Now, having said that, I want to turn back to the review questions because this is the appropriate point to consider this question having to do with, let's see what it says. Outline the steps between the first appearance of writing and the use of the alphabet. Why was writing important to the development of civilization? What is the Rosetta Stone? I haven't mentioned the Rosetta Stone, but I'm going to do so at the end of this question. Let me explain that. Let's review the history of writing in the ancient Middle East. We saw that the first writing was invented in Sumer, way back before 3000 BC, writing on this so-called cuneus or wedge writing, which was inscribed on clay tablets, wet clay tablets. And the Sumerian writing, first the cuneiform, first took the form of pictures, hence they were called pictographs. More or less at the same time, in Egypt, you have the chiseling, first of all, using chisels to basically write hieroglyphics, which are comparable to the cuneiform writing, because both cuneiform and hieroglyphics are syllabic writing. They're based on the consonants. Consonants, but there are some pictures, but it's mainly the consonants. But as I explained, only a few people. And in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, the priests were the only literate people. But this writing, the main function of this writing was practical. It enabled the government to collect taxes. It enabled the government to keep a census of property, who held what property. It allowed people to basically make wills, which they passed property from one generation to the next, basically the landlords. And of course, some merchants were able to record their transactions in this way. But this writing essentially was practical. At the same time, of course, the government also recorded the great events. The priests recorded the great events for the governments. And I noted that in Mesopotamia, we have this religious epoch from the Neo-Babylonian period, the Gilgamesh, first work of literature, and then the Hammurabi Code, which is the first legal code that we have. And then finally, we have the invention of the alphabet after 11. This is a repetition of what I just said, 1100 onwards, and I'm not going to go into it again. There's no point. But the point I'm going to make at this moment is to explain the Rosetta Stone, because it's a fascinating story. The question is, these languages were absolutely unknown to scholars. They came across these inscriptions in that is to say, European scholars came across these inscriptions at the end of the 18th century. Europe was beginning to expand and so on and conquer other places. And European travelers couldn't read any, neither the cuneiform or the hieroglyphics. But at the time of the French Revolution, exactly, in particular the 1797, Napoleon, who was this great usurping general of the French Revolution, Napoleon decided to invade Egypt to get around the English, to do in the English, who were his enemy. And so he takes an army to Egypt, and they're wandering around in different places and so on, and they run across a gigantic stone tablet. And this stone tablet, which is known as the Rosetta Stone, it happens that this stone, there was, dating back to the ancient world, around 200 BC, there was on this stone a government pronouncement. I think 198 is when it was written. There was a government announcement, and it was written in 3 languages, the same text. It was written in hieroglyphics, a kind of later form of Egyptian known as Demotic. It doesn't really matter. But it was also written down in Greek. And the Europeans knew Greek perfectly. So this Rosetta Stone became the key to basically learning. The Europeans could learn the Egyptian language, hieroglyphics. And that science opened the door for the also the translation of the Mesopotamian languages as well, eventually. So that's the significance of the Rosetta Stone. Now, today I want to conclude by beginning to discuss the Hebrews. Now, the Hebrews were insignificant. When we compare the Hebrews to the Mesopotamian empires and the Egyptian empires, this is a very insignificant country in this context. From a political and of course economic point of view, and archaeology, which is very well developed in this region. The archaeology was first done by Christians, and is now much of it is continued by the Israeli state. The archaeology has revealed a really poor country. I say this because the Old Testament gives you the sense of, well, the Hebrews were so important, so significant, but you can see from the archaeological remains that it was poor compared to Egypt and Mesopotamia, and politically insignificant. Now, the reason why it's important, of course, is it's highly creative religious culture. That's basically what I would say. It developed a very interesting religious culture, and we can say, to begin with, it's in this region that the inhabitants, the Hebrews, later known as the Jews. By the way, the term Jew comes from Judah. This is where part of these Hebrews lived. They lived, part of this area came to be known as Judah. And so eventually, these people who were first known as Hebrews in the 6th century BC, especially during their exile, they came to be known as Jews. That's the origin of the term. Well, they had a very interesting religious culture. They are the people who basically are credited with the development of what we call ethical monotheism, belief in a single God who controls the universe and who makes moral demands on individuals, all individuals. It's individualistic. Everybody has a religious life. That is interesting in itself. But of course, it's even more interesting because it gives us the context out of which later Christianity emerged. So sort of understanding the religiosity of the Jews gives us a background for our study of Christianity, which of course is important in terms of the essay that you will be writing. So with that, I leave you and wish you a good weekend as best as we can get. Thank you very much. you sick?
No, I think it was an allergy. The symptoms disappeared this morning.
It went away?
Yeah, it went away. But
Oh,
I'm
good.
still
You want to
wearing
go
it.
for a ride?
Yeah, let's go for a ride.
Very good. Oh, she's here. I hadn't seen her. I'll just shut down. I, I thought that you were, aren't you staying out there another day?
Yeah, we are. We're staying tonight. Yeah. No, we're
Are you having some fun or what?
we're having a great time.
You
We're
are?
having a great time.
Well, great.
We're relaxing.
What's that?
We are relaxing.
Oh, are you?
We're relaxing. Taking it
Very
easy.
nice. Did you have breakfast downstairs or did you have your own breakfast? Breakfast isn't any good.
No.
Was there anybody there?
Some people, no. Do you want to go or you don't want to go?
I do want to go. I'd like to get out of the house.
How was your lecture?
Oh, it was very good. Although I'm not sure whether it was recorded.
Oh,
You said it was recorded automatically.
I'm sure. Actually, I'm gonna do that. I'll go there.